The Eric Garner case never got that much media attention outside New York, but with the country on edge in the wake of the decision in Ferguson, a far, far different case, the video of Garner surrounded by police officers being grabbed in the chokehold that killed him is being replayed again and again, with commentators across the spectrum agreeing with the gist of this New York Daily News cover. We are breathless.
I will say that upon seeing the video that you just saw, and hearing Mr. Gardner say he could not breathe, I was extremely troubled. I would have loosened my grip. I desperately wish the officer would have done that.
Outrage over the case is pretty simple. Police officer was caught on camera killing an unarmed black man and got away with it. There aren't many Americans out there who think Garner's killing was justified.
And again, the media are debating whether there is a racial pattern.
I'm no longer shocked by these things. I have come to expect that when a police officer is in a situation like this, they will not be indicted, and if indicted, they will not be convicted.
A white grand jury puts themselves in those cops' shoes. A black grand jury will put themselves in the victim's shoes. That's the harsh reality of American justice today.
They tell us, at least, that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich. Well, clearly a black man's life is not worth a ham sandwich when you put these stories together.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage of crime in America, Sharyl Attkisson, author of the best-selling Stonewall, My Fight for Truth Against the Forces of Obstruction, Intimidation, and Harassment in Obama's Washington. Matt Lewis, senior contributor at the Daily Caller. And Richard Fowler, a syndicated radio talk show host. Sharyl, when you get right down to it, why are the media so united in the case of Eric Garner's death when Ferguson was and is so divisive?
I think, like they said, the evidence is different. There is a videotape. And this was an opportunity for people who have been criticizing the message that some saw out of Ferguson, including Fox News, to say, we're not just going to treat every incident that involves a white police officer and a black victim the same way. We are looking at the facts, and this was their opportunity to distinguish the two.
Even this morning, the Washington Post has a huge front-page story about the Ferguson case. Two lives collide, a nation divides, because there is still debate about it. But one difference, Matt, is that the St. Louis County prosecutor explained, whether you agree with that decision or not, why there was no indictment, released all the evidence. The New York prosecutor has not explained anything about why there were no charges brought in the Garner case. And so does this explain why some of the people on sort of your side of the ideological spectrum are being so critical of the handling of Eric Garner?
Well, I think so, but one might assume that the reason that they haven't explained it is that they don't have much good to explain. I mean, the video, if you watch the video, it's really almost impossible to justify what happened. Now, we can talk about, look, being a police officer is an incredibly difficult job. I believe the vast majority of police officers are good people trying to do what is right. But if you watch this video and you're intellectually honest, I don't see how you can justify it. And I've been actually very heartened to see a lot of conservatives very proactively speaking out saying this was wrong.
And especially because he was committing this petty crime of selling loose cigarettes. It just sort of adds insult to the injury, Richard. And a lot of conservative commentators, I would say, inclined to give the police the benefit of the doubt in these confrontations, but not in this case.
I completely agree here. I think the video was just so damning that it's impossible to sort of see beyond the fact that this guy was sitting on the ground for 11 minutes yelling, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. But I think larger than that, I think both in this case and the Ferguson case, before there was a grand jury decision, I think that the media took the side of the police more than they should have, and there should have been more of a balanced opinion. But with that being said, I'm proud to see that a lot of folks have come out and spoke out against this Eric Garner case, and I think it speaks to a larger narrative. And what if there was no video? That's what makes this unusual. Ferguson became a 24/7 story, in large measure, I would say, because of the riots, both when that happened, and then, of course, after the non-indictment. The Staten Island case has sparked nightly demonstrations in New York, also here in Washington, and across the country. But, there've been arrests, there's been blocking traffic, there has been, going into Macy's on 34th Street in Manhattan, but largely that's been peaceful. Has that affected the tone of the coverage?
It might have, but I also think maybe because people seem to be on the side of the victim in the second case versus the first case. I disagree that people gave police the benefit of the doubt in the early coverage of Ferguson. I think it was the opposite. But in this case, I think people did think that there was something wrong based on the videotape that was out. So the protesters maybe didn't feel as though nobody was listening to them. There was already, their viewpoint was being heard.
Interesting. So Al Sharpton, among those expressing outrage, and in this case, I can understand what he's saying, but once again playing the dual role of being a participant in the case, going to the press conference with with Eric Garner's widow and then interviewing her on his show on MSNBC. Let's take a look at that.
A cop on the street, Mika, has one job, and the job is to protect the people in that neighborhood. And it is not to make a statement that makes primetime people on MSNBC feel better about America.
Okay, that was the wrong soundbite, but I was going to play that later. Here's Joe Scarborough defending saying that a police officer has a tough job, and when he talks about the primetime pundits, he's talking about Chris Mathers, Rachel Maddow, Al Sharpton. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that was probably before the Garner case. I think that was I think that was responding to Ferguson,
yes.
Which, as we've noted, is entirely different. Look, I think Joe Scarborough has a very valuable role to play at MSNBC, and this was a time when his network was almost universally taking sides in this case, going to their respective corners, you know. And I think that, look, honestly, when you look at Ferguson, I recommend that Washington Post story. It is not clear at all what happened. And if you look...
Well, with the one exception that there is no dispute that Michael Brown went into that police car, attacked Darren Wilson, there was a struggle for the gun. I mean, we do know that. What happened in the,
and we have forensic evidence that I think shows. Yeah. So look, I think that what Joe Scarborough was saying was kind of heroic, is standing up to, in this case, his own network, and saying, look, police officers do have a very difficult job. They go out every day and put their lives on the line. I've been very critical of the police in the case of the Garner incident, and I think rightly so, but let's not bash the police universally.
But here's the thing, and I respect the rule of law. I respect what police officers do. I respect law enforcement. But I think there's an argument to be had that if you can't look at the Ferguson case, or you can't look at the Eric Garner case in a vacuum, right? You have to sort of take them out the vacuum and see the larger media narrative that sort of exists. Because I think the next story we'll be talking about in a couple weeks is Tamar Rice, the 12-year-old that was shot in Cleveland. And as you look at them in sort of this larger vacuum, you see that there is indeed a problem to the point where the United Nations is beginning to weigh in. And so I think as
is that problem reflected adequately, in your view, in the media coverage and the long-standing tensions between majority white police departments and some communities that are heavily minority?
Well, I think it's starting to, and I think the reason why it's starting to is because you have this sort of endless, consistent protest that you've seen. There are not 115 days of some sort of peaceful protest about this, and the more protest you have, the more the media is going to be forced to focus on this disparity. And because of that, I think we're making steps in the right direction, but I think we have to have a larger conversation about, you know, and I think it's the media's job to sort of push this forward, of is there indeed a problem in this country between African American men and police?
But I would say one problem we have, though, and you talked about Al Sharpton getting involved in this earlier, is right now I think we have a situation where we're almost all united in terms of what happened to Eric Garner was wrong, the grand jury should have indicted, and there are solutions. There are body cams, for example, the mandate that I think is going forward. If this becomes, if Al Sharpton demagogues this and makes it solely about race, you could have the unfortunate effect of whites retreating to their corner where they reflexively defend the police, and blacks assuming every time that the police are wrong, and it's just not that way.
Well, I'll play that Sharpton soundbite for you in a minute, the one we failed to get up earlier. But
can I say something about the problem as a journalist with covering this story to me, and maybe I'm alone in thinking this. There's a difference between police officers who may have made really bad mistakes and proof that they made those mistakes because they were racially motivated. And in both of the cases, maybe I've missed it, but I haven't seen evidence of a pattern on the part of the police officer who was accused, evidence that they shouted racial slurs, that they had some sort of thing that we can hang on to that proves why they did what they did, or the mistakes that they made were because of that.
There is no such evidence, but there is a gut feeling, I think, that if Eric Garner, if Michael Brown had been white, would these tragedies have unfolded in the same way? And you cannot prove that.
It's a fair question to ask. Advocates can ask it, but I think as a journalist reporting it, you have to be careful to understand what the evidence says and doesn't say.
I want to let you in on that, but let me play this Al Sharpton, because again, he is part of the story, appearing with Eric Garner's widow and then having her on the MSNBC show. Roll it.
Esau, we have been working together since this tragedy happened, me and your mother-in-law. I mean, explain how you feel tonight. You haven't talked to anybody.
No,
publicly.
I feel now, after the verdict, you know, of course I was disappointed, angry, you know.
Do you have a problem with, we saw this in Ferguson as well, Sharpton, the activist, Sharpton, the MSNBC commentator?
Again, I think we know who Al Sharpton is, and I think there's no pretense that that's a journalistic show. It's an activist show. That's where the industry is headed. I'm okay with it because we know what it is.
I'm okay with it, too, for the same reason.
I think you pick one side or the other. You can't cover yourself, which is what he too often is doing. But pick up on Cheryl's point about no overt evidence, no explicit racial slurs, and how that influences the coverage of these cases. Or, you know, do you really need that kind of evidence? Because in your view, is there a pattern of the way these things play out?
Here's the thing. My mom says it best. Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? And I think in all these cases, you've seen some level of smoke. Yeah, you haven't seen racial slurs, but you've indeed seen some level of smoke. And I think it's the job of good media reporting to sort of say, well, is there a problem here? Let's look at the statistics. Let's look at sort of what the broad brush of statistics say. Is there a problem between African-American men and police? And if there is one, how do we get to the bottom of it? Body cameras is a step in the right direction, but clearly in New York City, that didn't work.
Not a panacea. All right, let me get a break. Remember, we want to hear from you. Join our conversation. Go on Twitter. Send me some messages at Howard Kurtz, and we, of course, will read some at the end of the program.